We've all seen them. A movement in the corner of our eye, a dark shadow. Perhaps when we turn our head to look, it's gone. But where did it go? How could it just disappear? Are these interdimensional beings moving freely between spaces? Shadow people are known to offer glimpses in our peripheral vision over and again until we are on edge, wondering, what is happening? Am I going mad? Then, bam, there they are, right in front of you, no longer bothering to hide. What happens next? Take a look at one woman's true story, a mind-blowing experience with a shadow person or shadow people which spanned 8 years. Late one night, about 8 years ago, I saw from the corner of my eye someone coming out of my son's bedroom. His bedroom is at the far end of a long and wide corridor, and the lights were on. I assumed it was my son, who was 5 years old at the time, but when I looked, I realised it wasn't. It appeared to be the shadow of a boy, but this shadow was tri-dimensional and solid enough to block the light. I sat there with my eyes and mouth wide open, wondering if I was dreaming or hallucinating or what. Well, the shadow turned its head towards the place where I was sitting. It had no eyes or facial features, but I knew it was able to see me because when our eyes apparently met, the shadow jumped as if startled. Then it stood very straight facing me with its arms pressed against the sides as if petrified with fear, and at the same time, I suppose, wondering what to do or what I would do. We remained like that for what felt like a few minutes until I decided to approach it because I really wanted to know what it was. But at my slightest movement, the shadow turned to the right and ran, or should I say glided, at amazing speed towards the opposite wall. And as it did, it shrunk. It changed into a sort of elongated black blob that stretched and finally flattened out enough to slip and hide under a large plant pot. I immediately got up and tried to move the plant pot, but it was too heavy. Then I went in to check if my son was all right, and to my relief, I found him happily asleep. I spent the rest of that night watching over my son, but for some reason, I wasn't afraid of the shadow. I was thrilled with what I'd seen. Well, I didn't mention this to anyone, but a few days afterwards, my son asked me to spend the night with him because he had seen what he called a mud man in his room. This monster was, according to his description, a small man that was entirely dark. I guess that's the reason why he thought it was made of mud. I spent more than just one night in his room, and about 4 weeks later, my son woke me up whispering, "Mum, someone's opening the door." And yes, the door was being opened, and I saw a dark hand on the doorknob. I sat up on the bed quite scared, not so much thinking that this was the mud man, but some real-life thief. But when I could see as far as its elbow, it started to close the door very slowly without entering the room. So I told my son that it was probably just his dad checking on us. Well, I went into my husband's room then, but he was deeply asleep. Fast forward a few years later, and I woke up one night and saw another shadow in my room. This one ran into the bathroom and I went in after it, but it had disappeared. Coincidentally, my son dreamt that very same night that a man made of smoke was in his room. It wasn't until a few years ago that I began to see the shadows regularly, especially a tall shadow with broad shoulders that stood next to my bed almost every night. It might sound strange, but I enjoyed watching it until I fell asleep. For some reason, I believed that it was friendly. One night, I saw its face. It looked like the negative of a photograph, but with very simple features. that almost resembled a child's drawing of a human face. That's why I thought it wasn't really its face, but something the shadow wanted me to believe. In other words, it pretended to look human. But what really caught my eye were 5 white dots, like coins, along what appeared to be its hairline. Not long after, my family and I went on vacation, and I asked the shadow to stay there in the house. A week or so later, when we came home, I felt there was something very angry in the house. I could almost breathe it. I began to unpack and organise our stuff when lights began to flicker in my room, and this didn't happen anywhere else in the house. My CD player wouldn't work until many hours later, and that afternoon, when I was carrying food on a tray, something hit me in the arm. I screamed and dropped everything. I got this strange red bruise on my arm, and that night I began to have these nightmares of terrible things happening to my children. I had them for 3 consecutive nights, and each time I woke up, the shadow was standing close to my bed. On the 3rd night, I got pretty upset because I came to the conclusion that the shadow was threatening me, so I asked the shadow to leave my house at once. And it apparently did, for a short time at least, because one night I woke up and saw the shadow standing in my bedroom's doorway. It jumped onto the bed, crawled on all 4s, even over my husband's body, and landed flat on top of me, holding my wrists tightly against the mattress. All I could move was my head, and this thing was so heavy that I couldn't breathe at all. I thought I was going to die. I looked right into its dark, featureless face, and this is the strangest part. I could feel its warm breath on my face, meaning that this being is able to breathe. Is it a ghost? It also had a peculiar smell that I can't describe it well because it's unlike any other smell. All I could say is that it was a pungent smell of something metallic and very sour. I struggled with it as hard as I could and managed to push it off. When I was able to breathe again, I yelled at the top of my lungs, waking up my husband, and I saw the shadow leave the room quickly. I haven't seen any more shadow people for over a year now, but I am terrified of them. Shadow people are real, and in my opinion, they're not spirits, but living forms of some kind. They can change in shape like Play-Doh. And they're not always dark. I've seen them change from dark to light, and they're not able to vanish in midair nor cross through solid surfaces, but use doors and other openings instead. If they appear to vanish, it is because they can move very fast and shrink to fit into narrow, tight spaces where they hide or slip through. I think they develop these abilities as a way to survive and as camouflage. What better way to blend into the background than to appear as shadows or lights? And one last thing, I believe that they're studying us. What an extraordinary account. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. This woman's experience spanned many years, and I really must commend her for having kept herself calm and clear-headed throughout it. She makes some really interesting observations based on her own experiences of what these shadow people are and how they are able to move about, mostly unseen. I'd love to delve deeper into the presence of shadow people. The one thing which really piques my interest, as in the case of this woman, was whether she was dealing with one shadow person over the period of years, or were there many? The behaviour certainly varied over time. It went from benevolent to, well, potentially deadly. There are clearly similarities between these sightings and the experience of sleep paralysis, also known as visits from the old hag, which I have featured in an earlier episode. Check that one out if you haven't seen it. I can't help wondering if these shadow people roam freely or are somehow attached to a place. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to read them. Don't forget, if you enjoy my videos, you might consider becoming a member of my YouTube channel. Not only would you be supporting my channel, but you also get some sweet treats and exclusive content. Remember, it's a strange world. Keep your eyes and ears open and be kind. Cheerio!